First of all, thank you very much for your time and for your help with this small project. Um, can you tell me a little bit about yourself? What you do when you started?
For sure. My name's Kim, and I currently work at BT as Research Operations Manager. And I started working in research operations, I think, in 2019. So it's been about 3 years now. And prior to that, I worked a bit in operations, a bit in customer service, a bit more in sort of client-facing roles and things like that. So I've got a bit of a broad breadth of experience in different jobs, but have always worked in technology companies and have always been fascinated by user research.
So you had prior experience with ops, like in the broader sense.
Yeah, I spent maybe a year in an ops role in like a customer complaints team. So there was it was a company where we had a lot of our own internal tooling. So there was a lot of thinking about how we handle complaints as like a service and as a flow, both in terms of for the customer, but also in terms of our products internally and what they allowed us to do or not do. So there was a bit of thinking about that sort of stuff, which I think then is quite transferable into the world of research ops.
Are there any striking differences between ops that you worked in before and research ops? Or is it basically the same thing?
Um, I think I think the biggest difference is the subject matter expertise. Like, I don't know if that's a bit of an obvious thing to say, but it's the just having this sort of knowledge of the research flow. Specifically, that's so important. Like, you need to understand how researchers work and what your specific research team and your organization's goals are, what their strategy is, and like how best you can underpin that. Like, that's the way I see research ops is all about sort of supporting that user research strategy. And I think that where I've done ops in the past, I don't know whether it's just a maturity thing and I wasn't thinking this way yet, but it felt less about supporting an overarching strategy, whereas research ops really feels like bolstering a team and bolstering a function, and giving them, the right platform to do what they need to do within design.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
That's very interesting because, as far as I know, there are two kind of schools of thinking about research ops. One is that research ops person is basically an admin, and as admin, it doesn't matter really what you support. It's just the same thing. You support the team, you make the things running smoothly. Another school is that you really need to understand what researchers do, and in that case, many research ops people who were hired recently, I know that they used to be researchers, they just switched the role. So you're saying it's something in between. You need to be both aware of what researchers do, but at the same time, you need to have knowledge of operational side.
Yes, I think it sits somewhere between the two, which is why I I would say that people from lots of different backgrounds could be good at research ops. I think that someone with a research background could be great at research ops as long as they know that they're not a researcher anymore.
Mhm.
And I think that people from other backgrounds like EAs, personal assistants, I don't know, people who've been in other ops roles also bring that, but they need to also make sure that they have a passion and an understanding of research and maybe sort of challenge some of their assumptions around it and really get stuck in and understand how it is that their colleagues work. So yeah, I agree. I think you need both parts to really come
Mhm.
together.
You said that there is, if a researcher working in research ops, they need to understand they're not researching anymore. What do you mean by that? What kind of maybe skill set or I don't know career path is kind of closed?
Yeah, I mean, it's maybe not so much about not being a researcher anymore. Like maybe that was a little bit harsh in terms of phrasing because you do still want to do research. You want to measure your impact that you're having on the team. You want to measure the impact you're having on how insights are being delivered, and sort of the quality of the participants you're getting, and all of that takes research skills, and that
Mhm.
skill set's really really useful in ops. But I think it's also I think just from experience working with researchers, the number one thing I hear them say when I'm introducing myself as research ops is, "Oh, I hate admin. Can you take all the admin away?" And I think obviously everyone has to do a certain amount of admin when they're a researcher, like recruiting participants and preparing for research is really that is the chunky bit of the iceberg that no one sees that goes on behind the scenes.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that researchers maybe they're great at that and they're good at that, but it's also sort of maybe a less interesting part of the job. And I think coming into ops means you do need to deal with a bit more of that. And it's not just the ops or admin involved in running research, it's the ops and admin involved in like procuring tools, for example. Like,
Mhm.
you need to be dealing with suppliers, dealing with sales teams, dealing with procurement, dealing with finance, and that's a lot of um that's quite a lot of paperwork and there's quite a lot of admin there. So I think remembering that that is part of your role and you need to push really hard on that and you need to know sort of how to deal with sales teams, how to get what you want out of suppliers. That's like a skill set to develop. I think sort of having those negotiation tactics and skills is a really important thing. And if you've not done that before in a research role, then that's maybe a skill to develop. But a lot of researchers who become research ops people have been a team of one, or maybe they've led a research team, so they've done a bit of that in their day-to-day already. So yeah, it sort of just depends how familiar they are with that kind of thing.
Can you describe the scope of tasks that you've been doing?
Yeah, I think it's been pretty broad. I don't know if anyone sort of listening is familiar with the Research Ops Community Skills Map. It's great. Definitely check it out. It's on Mural. And it kind of covers everything, all from governance to research spaces, to research tools, to sort of knowledge management and sharing, to sort of team cohesion and activities. It's very, very, very broad. And I do think that in my role in Research Ops, I've touched on pretty much all of those parts of the puzzle. The only thing I don't really do a lot of myself is participant recruitment. I think this is just part of a personal bias towards how I like to run research ops. It's not that I don't get involved in recruitment at all. There's a constant dialogue between me and the researchers about what's working, what's not working, and I feed that back into the businesses and suppliers we work with, or to the internal teams who help us with our recruitment and try and make those things better. But I would never sort of step in to run the recruitment myself, if that makes sense. Whereas there are other operations teams who do work that way, and then they have quite large teams with lots of research ops specialists who do recruitment. And I think, again, it all really depends on like what industry you're in and how you want to run your team and the difficulty of the recruitment requests you get. It's sort of not one size fits all, but just in my personal experience, recruitment isn't something I've done a lot of.
What's the reason behind that?
Honestly, probably a large part, I'm not going to lie, probably a large part personal bias towards probably not wanting to take that work on, and not really wanting to run my team in that way. I've only ever worked in research ops teams of one, so I felt like spending all of my time fulfilling recruitment briefs wasn't the most impactful thing I could be doing, whereas I could be helping on things like democratizing research and helping the design teams to do their own research to free up more time in the research teams to do generative research, which was supporting that research strategy. That felt like a more impactful thing to work on. I've worked on sort of improving on processes, improving on the tools that we have, the spaces that we have, making sure the researchers essentially have everything they need to do their jobs as effectively as possible. And for me, that felt like a more fulfilling thing to be doing, and also something that leaves a bigger impact than me just fulfilling briefs. And I think also I've had, I guess, the environments I've been working in have been very UK based, and our customer base has been sort of all consumer products. So they're people who are generally not too challenging to recruit, and that we've had not too many difficulties in getting hold of. So it's also not a specialised. It's not like other colleagues of mine in research ops who I know have to, contact very specific business contacts in very specific parts of the world who do specific jobs. It's much, much harder to get hold of those people, and you need to be a bit more innovative in the things you do. Yeah.
Interesting. So that leads to another question. You said that recruitment is not the most impactful kind of task that you can do. If we lived in the ideal world and you could delegate absolutely everything, no problem, with kind of 100% certainty it would be done well, what, let's say, three the most impactful thing you would still keep for yourself?
For me, I think my favorite thing has been sort of teaching and education. So it's all been about helping designers and other parts of the business to learn how to do research. I think it's really fulfilling in that it can be a really big team activity. Like all the researchers can get involved, however much or little they want to. Everybody's always really excited to learn about research. Everyone wants to be a researcher, I think, somewhere in the back of their mind. And it's exciting to get close to customers. It creates like more and more empathy across the business. So that's really exciting and really fun. And also it just, I think research is at a sort of really transitional point at the minute where a lot of teams are trying to push their generative research and really do a lot more of that. And I think it's a common discussion among many research teams from many organizations and many backgrounds. So it just feels like a bit of a hot topic right now, and is something that's in the front of my mind, and just an interesting space to work in, an interesting problem to try and work on. So I think that's probably what I'd keep.
Interesting. Any other areas, or would you focus just on that?
Um, I mean, it's also interesting with the pandemic, isn't it? Because it's like, I mean, this feels like maybe not an ops job, but like I think working on it'd be great to see research about the difference between remote research methods and sort of in-person research methods, and what the strengths and weaknesses of each of those are, what types of insights you generate from each, how we can leverage the strengths of each different type of research, because there's no way we're stopping doing remote research now that the pandemic's kind of quietening down. We're definitely going to keep doing that, and it's kind of like I'd really love to know how and when we should be leaning into that versus face-to-face research. And obviously we do have a sense of what would be better, but to really get some data on that would be really interesting. I'd really like to explore that and understand that, and sort of come up with the world-class set of options for what to choose, what method to choose for what piece of research. Like that would be a really cool thing to get to dive into.
That's very interesting because I think that makes your approach pretty unique. A lot of research ops people we talk to, they are kind of in the mindset that let me know what you need and I'll do that. In your case, it's kind of conducting research on researchers to understand what they might need in the future. Maybe they don't realize that yet, but it would be good if you bring them that option.
Yeah, and to be clear, it's kind of like very much the way I work is very collaborative. So it wouldn't be me kind of dictating to researchers what I think they should do in their job, because that's not my game, it's not my expertise, but it's a kind of like working to collaborate with them to create those kinds of studies and those observations, and to gather that data with the team, and then kind of to analyze that together and work out what our specific needs are for this team in this environment in this company. I think that's kind of the approach I take. And like again, I think that those needs might change from business to business. I wouldn't expect them to actually be the same from place to place.
Mm-hmm.
I think that research is one of those subjects where the answer is often, well, it depends. And I think that's just because the needs vary so much, and there's a lot of nuance in research.
Interesting. Okay, reversing the question. I'm pretty sure there are a lot of things that you have to do that you don't believe makes a very big impact on the organization, because in all big companies we have to do that. If you could read of 3 things that you spend your time but you would rather delegate it to somebody else, what would it be?
I think I do struggle with kind of like the sort of procurement and sort of more paperworky side of things. I think that's always it's something that can be slower than you feel that it should take. So I do find that a little bit, you need to sort of really get your resilience going when you're onboarding a tool and things like that. So that would actually be something I'd probably be quite keen to delegate to someone else. But that's probably the only thing that really springs to mind. I don't think that anything, I think most of I've been fortunate to like work on a lot of stuff that I think does leave a really big impact. And like even, bringing tools in is also really impactful. It just always feels like it takes a bit longer than it should to get there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting. If you could think about yourself just starting in this role, what advice you would give to yourself? Maybe 3 things to do, 3 things to avoid.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think 3 things to do. So definitely be curious about everything. I think this applies to most jobs in the world. Like don't, just challenge every assumption you have about everything. Always ask the question, even if you think you know the correct answer, just ask, because like I said before, I think there's a lot of differences and individualities to each research team that you work with, and I think it's good to clarify what those are for your team. So just be endlessly curious, keep challenging, keep asking questions.
Can you give maybe an example of something you learned you thought you knew, but
I'm trying to think. Maybe things like preferences as well within the team. So like I think when we were building the labs at BT, I was worried that the researchers might not want to do face-to-face research for safety concerns and reasons. Like as the pandemic was quietening down, I was worried that we'd gotten so much value out of our remote tools that maybe face-to-face research just seemed sort of more time-consuming. Those were kind of concerns in the back of my mind. But then actually speaking to the researchers about it and seeing the excitement and the appetite made me think, oh, actually, it's totally worth doing. And of course, we need this. And that makes a lot of sense. And kind of started to understand their point of view and where they were actually coming from rather than where I assumed they were coming from. So that's probably a big example I'd call out for that.
Sorry, I interrupted you. You've listed 3 things you would recommend yourself.
Okay, that's fine.
The second one?
The second one would be, I think, it's hard because like this is not advice I probably could have taken at the time, but I think do you be prepared to fight for how you think the function should run? I think that you from spending all that time with researchers, asking all those questions, getting all that insight into how they work and what they're trying to achieve and what they're trying to do, you are best placed to decide how to support that. And I think there can be lots of sort of conflicting demands for your time coming into you, and you have to decide how to prioritize those things. And you kind of obviously you want to try and find that sweet spot between what's good for the business and what's good for the researchers. But if you get pushed back on something that you definitely think is the wrong direction to go in, don't be afraid to fight and kind of argument that and showcase why you think the direction you would prefer to take is why you think that's the right direction. Because I think I was a bit worried about that as someone newer to design and to research ops, which I think is natural because when you are newer to something, you're not an expert and your confidence is less. So I think totally normal, but yeah, don't shy away from fights, I think.
Do you mean like political fights in the company when you need to have leverage on the decision?
Not so much political fights, but I think more just I sort of wouldn't, I guess I wouldn't use that word, but it is more kind of just having a bit of sort of like things like prioritization around objectives and what the backlog for the next 6 months might look like for research ops. So for example, you might, because you're spending lots of time with researchers, you might see that actually there's a lot of foundational things that aren't in place yet. Like it's really hard to pay for a survey tool, or it's really hard to incentivize participants when you get them through your online forum, or there's these specific problems that actually come up a few times a month, again and again and again. And those aren't on leadership's radar yet because they're looking at much bigger picture things. And you want to support with the bigger picture things, but also it's quite hard to do that if your foundational things aren't in place. So it's kind of stuff like raising awareness, maybe more than being sort of political, but like really saying, hey, this is an issue, and sort of sticking up for your team in that way, I think is important to do. But you can, maybe at the beginning, you can feel a lack of confidence in doing that because you're not, because you're new to it. And I've been unsure in the past, and now I think I'm a bit more vocal about, hey, I do want to support with this, but there's this other issue I want you to look at, and it's causing problems for XYZ reason, and it means that it's got this impact on product delivery or whatever. So it's sort of having those conversations, I think.
Interesting. So what we saw is that research ops people are hired for a reason, right? Because the process on itself, it just doesn't work. You need someone running the process. And that often includes kind of dealing with issues that nobody sees. The people were not aware of that. So you're hired to deal with something that even your management are not aware of. So that means that in many cases, you need to highlight the issue first, kind of sell it to everyone, saying like, this is the issue, not something that you focused on before. This is how we need to deal with that. And that's why you need to change the roadmap from your management perspective and from the research perspective. Is that what you're
Yes, correct.
saying?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, it was the second one. Third advice.
Third thing. What would the third one be?
Maybe something super practical.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know if I have anything that practical. I feel like it's almost just actually maybe a bit more vague and a bit more just sort of have confidence that you can do the stuff, because I think there's a lot of like more, particularly being like a non-man in like quite a technical space, which research ops can be, because you're often like, if you're building labs, for example, and you've got all this like audio visual equipment and all these other like words being thrown around and like jargon to bust through, and it's not something I wouldn't necessarily say I'm a super tech savvy person. yeah, I'm fine with tech.
Mm-hmm.
And like I have a lot of like recording equipment and stuff at home that I like using, but I don't know loads about it. It's not like a huge passion of mine. Um, and I feel like I can feel a bit insecure about those types of things, and like maybe feel like I don't know what I'm doing. But just having a bit of faith that if you keep asking questions and you keep clarifying things, that you will make the correct decisions, and you know bring in the experts that you need when you need them, and you will get to the right goal in the end.
Yeah.
Because it can feel a bit overwhelming, I think, when you're dealing with so much new stuff that maybe doesn't feel like you're an expert in.
As far as I understand, there are two approaches how research ops operates. They can rely on other internal departments. Like, for example, if you need to build a lab, you just go to your IT and AV people. If you want to bring furniture, you just go to your facilities, for example, properties,
Mm-hmm.
and whatever they bring is fine. Another approach is when you actually conduct research on researchers and you understand what specifically needs to be done. Relying on internal departments sometimes can be tricky because their use case is just different. They don't build labs, they build meeting rooms or office spaces. So in this case, what was your kind of path for working with internal teams and kind of navigating through that internal landscape?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think probably a bit of a mix of the two. Like, I think both companies I've done research ops for have very different landscapes and very different ways of working, and they're both very, very different in scale. So therefore, completely different sort of challenges when it comes to working with other teams. I think the one thing that's common across both is that you absolutely need those relationships in place with, you know, compliance, with legal, with finance, with procurement, with IT, with security. All those teams need to be, you know, you need to be known to them. They need to understand what user research is, and you need to be able to have a conversation as and when questions come up. And I think that building those relationships is like one of the important things to do first. Is like that typical sort of interview question of like, oh, what would you do in your first 90 days? And it's like, well, in the first 2 weeks, I would get to know all of these people and set up those relationships and like get regular meetings in place. And it's even for like smaller teams, like maybe you might have an accessibility lead or an accessibility specialist or even an accessibility team, like getting really close with them is also really important for research ops to make sure you're baking everything in right from the start. So I think I think working with those teams is incredibly important. And just coming back to your question, so I think you were asking about what my experience of that has been. So I think in the smaller companies I've worked for, it's been more simple to get something more customized for user research purposes, because you can contact usually someone a bit more senior who sort of runs their function. So they have a bit more they have a better understanding of exactly what it is you're looking for and kind of that will to help you as an internal customer. I think somewhere the bigger places I've worked for, it's harder to get to like an individual, and you kind of end up speaking to help desks of teams because they're so big. So you get maybe a different person each time. And you don't have the same relationship, so you're not so much in that customer situation, and you find that you're re-explaining what you need many more times, and it just means it takes a bit longer. I've definitely been able to get things that are really specific for user research, but it just takes a little bit longer to get there and a bit more patience and a bit more repetition.
Do you feel that you still need to get the specific person who actually understands you, or do you just go through the standard process and the process eventually gets you there?
I think that the process eventually gets you there. It's always helpful when you do find someone who shines through, who just really gets it. That's always like a nice moment of like, oh, great. And I think, you know, I'm eternally grateful for those people because they do come up, and it's great to feel like you've kind of got an ally through that process. And even someone who can give you a bit of a hack to kind of say, oh, you know, come in this way or speak to this person or, you know, sort of help guide you through the organization. I think that's to be expected in any business that's of considerable size. Yeah.
Speaking about the broader perspective, as soon as we started to work on building UX infrastructure, I realized that I had a lot of kind of misconceptions or myths about how it works. Like one of the myths I personally had was If you need a lab, just go to facilities, we'll build your lab. We tried it multiple times in Google, and it never actually worked that way. So there was a special team for that, but even that was complicated. Do you think that there are any myths about research ops from people who are just starting or who are in the area for some time?
I think actually what you said before is maybe a bit of a myth. I think when I meet people who haven't really heard of research ops before, often when we meet the first time, they'll be like, "Oh, so you're an admin person then?" And I'm like, "No, not exactly." Um, and I think they sort of just see it as just the paperwork, just taking on the things that researchers don't want to deal with, maybe doing a bit of recruitment, maybe supporting on studies. And it's, that's not, it can be part of the role. But for me, that's not the foundation of the role, because that, for me, research ops is a scaling function. It is a function that allows you to like 10x your research impact.
Mm-hmm.
And doing those little tactical tasks isn't going to do that for you. So if you want to get value out of research ops, I see it as much more strategic than tactical. It's much more sort of tasks that really push forward that your goals and your aspirations as a research team.
This is fantastic what you said about scaling function. I think this is exactly what we see in multiple cases, when sometimes the management doesn't understand what research ops people do. It's just they hire someone and suddenly research starts working. And there are so many different things need to be done, I think, organization-wise. Like, for example, very often research ops person is put in hierarchy, is put like at the very bottom, like under researchers, like almost like an admin role, but without admin kind of capabilities and opportunities. And as a result of that, we saw multiple cases, like very big organizations, like thousands of people working there. When they try to optimize their structure, they do something that makes the research ops person leave, and suddenly the whole team stops working well. And it often comes as a surprise to them, because they see it as it's just an admin. We can hire any person from the street.
Yeah.
And it's not like that.
Yeah, I've been lucky that I've never really had that experience with leadership. I think that in both the places I've worked, the leadership's been really bought into what ops can do and what it is. So I feel like where I've had to bust the myth of, oh, you're an admin, it's actually maybe more with sort of people who are new to being a researcher or new to work generally, or maybe people who aren't in research. They might just work in design more broadly or another part of a business. And it generally seems to be people who are more sort of just new to work generally. So obviously they have more questions and more misconceptions because they've had less time sort of around people in work. I think that I've been lucky, like as I mentioned, with the teams I've joined, where they've kind of seen the value of other ops teams like DevOps or design ops. At BT, for example, they invested in design ops really like early on and have an incredible function. So I think that I didn't have to challenge that myth too much. And I think they know that the sort of breadth of things that ops touches on. I think that maybe a misconception I see a little bit is that I think research ops is really rich. It's really quite broad. And when you think about research tools alone, the number of tools a researcher has to use to even run, 5 simple interviews can be immense. It could be maybe like 7 tools just to get some participants through the door. And when you think about the work that takes to coordinate, that's really quite a lot. So I think maybe a misconception I can see is that maybe there's more investment in design ops because we think, oh, design ops, that's huge, and then there'll be one research ops person, when actually I think that research ops and design ops are comparable in size, and maybe there should be as much investment in research ops as there is in design ops.
Even though the design team is larger than the research team.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Because I think that's actually it. Like a lot of the time people think, oh, ratio based, oh, we need, 4 design ops people to every 10, not every 10, sorry, one design ops person to every 10 to 20 designers, and we'll do the same for research, so you end up with 1 research ops person. But when you think about the sort of number of tools used in research, actually maybe that's a little unbalanced. Maybe we want to think about not just a ratio of ops to maker, but maybe ops to tools to makers to, what is our strategy as well? Because, if you think, oh, we'll get one ops person to look after our research team of 10, but we also have the ambition to make sure all of our designers can do their own research and we have 200 designers, you also might want to think, well, actually, that means that one person's looking after 210 people, not just 10 people. So, yeah, there's maybe more to factor into that decision. I don't know.
I think that totally makes sense, because I think another factor is that in the design team, a lot of things are already kind of settled. You know exactly what software you're going to use, how you're going to use that. You need the laptop, you know where to buy it, how to support it, and so on. If you're a researcher, a lot of those things is like, okay, let's sit and discuss how we can design and build that.
Exactly. It's a lot of like on the fly. Okay, we have this really specific requirement for, I don't know, if it's something quite niche, like it could be a diary study. And it's like, okay, so we can maybe do this over WhatsApp, and we can maybe, it's sort of hacking together bits and pieces for each specific case. And I think, yeah, it can accelerate quite quickly, versus maybe workflows that are maybe more well established in design. Whereas, things still feel quite new in research.
So if, for example, you're a CEO of this company or of any other company, and somebody told you that you need to hire a research ops person, would you give that person extra power, or I don't know, extra maybe team, maybe an admin, anything that kind of is not common, but you know that it would help a lot?
Got you. Oh.
I know it's a very theoretical question. It's difficult to kind of generalize.
Yeah, just trying to think what I would do differently.
Like in your specific case, would it help you if you had just an admin to be able to focus on, I don't know, bureaucracy, for example, dealing with other teams inside the organization, or procurement?
Maybe, like, again, it really like you said, it's hard to generalize because it really depends on what organization you're in, because there'll be different challenges in each one. I guess where I am now, yes, it would probably be handy to have someone to help with some of those internal processes and tools, because I think when you're running a few different big projects at once, it can be really hard to maintain that momentum when there's a lot of like internal hoops to jump through. So I think having someone to push on those would be really helpful. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's also maybe some. I think this isn't maybe about what I would add on to research ops, but maybe what I would add into an organization is that, make sure we've got these excellent feedback loops and these sort of lines. And again, my experience of this has been really positive. But I think that's the thing, making sure that those lines to the top are there, so information is getting filtered from your manager up, so you have the opportunity to create those changes that I mentioned before. So when you notice something that's important that actually isn't on their radar yet, you have a way to get it to them. Because I think when you feel a bit powerless or like you can't get through to them, that's when it can feel like your resilience can become really low, or at least for me personally, I think not being heard or listened to is something I find personally really challenging. So having that opportunity to be heard and having those lines of communication open is a really good thing. So not necessarily something I'd change in my experience, because I've been fortunate to have that. But I think that if that didn't exist, that's what I'd want to add in.
That's very interesting. It seems like we're getting back to the question of research ops people are hired to optimize the process in addition to sorting out practical issues. So it's not just making those issues to go away invisibly, it's just changing the process to make sure that those issues don't happen in the first place. And for that, you need the feedback loop to people who actually build the process.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So.
Is there anything I forgot to ask? Anything important in your role that you wish other people knew?
Let me think. I don't know. I feel like the only thing I would say is like maybe two things. If I could share two things that I think would make, if you do work with a research ops person, I think two things that will make them very happy is, one is we all want to collaborate. I think most of the research ops colleagues I speak to get the most out of their job when they're able to really actively collaborate with the researchers on their team on a really regular basis. whether that's sort of studying the researchers themselves and their processes, just shadowing things, getting involved in projects together, really tackling those projects as a team. It's been a really excellent thing at BT. Like, we work very, very collaboratively, and it's made it a joy. Like, it's been absolutely wonderful. So I think you know, if your research ops person is trying to get time with you, do try and go for it, because it will make everything you create together so much better. And I think the other thing I would say is that I think, again, a similarity I notice among people who go for research ops is that we're sort of that sort of bias towards helping and sort of making people's lives better. I think we've all sort of got that fundamental motivation of like, I just want to make this better. And I think that also plays into maybe having a weakness of overextending ourselves slightly and sort of getting involved in maybe one too many things at a time. And I think, yeah, just keep an eye out for, obviously it's up to us to manage that and make sure we're not doing that and sort of keeping ourselves well balanced. But if you do start seeing your research ops person dragging their feet a little bit, just maybe say, you know, have you said no to something in the last few months? Maybe start saying no, you know, just give them a reminder that they can do that as well. Yeah.
I think this is super important as well, because I think the nature of your role is that there are no limits of what you can and probably should do. The process can be improved in multiple from multiple perspectives, and there's just no hard line like, okay, you stop working here and then everything should be fine.
Yeah, like everything is done now, where that line never, that doesn't exist. There's never an everything is done now. Yeah. So it can just go on and on.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for your help.
You're welcome.